The dog wouldn't stop digging. His claws scraped against rusted metal with a sound that set teeth on edge, a rhythmic scraping that echoed through the empty warehouse like a desperate plea. Chen stood in the dim light filtering through grimy windows, watching his Belgian Malinois, Riker, attack the floor of the ancient armored truck with an intensity that made his chest tighten. The dog had been trained for bomb detection in Kandahar, had saved Marcus's life twice, and had never once shown interest in anything that wasn't a genuine threat. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. But now, in this forgotten corner of industrial Detroit, Riker was pawing at corroded steel like his life depended on it, whining in a pitch Marcus had never heard before, a sound of pure desperate urgency that raised every hair on the back of his neck. The coffee at the VA hospital in Dearborn tasted like burnt rubber, but Chen drank it anyway because it was free and because the alternative was going back to his studio apartment where the silence pressed against his skull like a vice. He sat in the waiting room, his prosthetic leg stretched out in front of him, the titanium and carbon fiber apparatus that had replaced everything below his right knee feeling particularly heavy today. Riker lay at his feet, a coiled spring of tan and black fur, his intelligent eyes tracking every person who walked through the double doors. The dog never truly relaxed, not anymore. Neither did Marcus. The appointment had been routine, just another check-in with Dr. Brennan to adjust his medications, to talk about the dreams that still woke him at 3 in the morning, drenched in sweat that smelled like fear and gunpowder. The doctor meant well, they all did, but Marcus had learned that talking about the things he'd seen, the friends he'd lost, the moment the IED had turned his life into a before and after, didn't actually make any of it better. It just made it more real, more present, like picking at a wound that refused to heal. He was 32 years old, though some days he felt ancient, like he'd lived several lifetimes and none of them had been particularly kind. His black hair was cut military short, more out of habit than preference, and his face carried the lean, angular features of his Chinese-American heritage. His mother's cheekbones, his father's serious mouth. Both of them gone now, his mother to cancer 3 years before he'd enlisted, his father to a heart attack while Marcus was on his second tour. He'd missed both funerals. The army had sent him home for his father's service, but he'd been so deep in the fog of grief and guilt that he barely remembered standing at the graveside. Riker shifted, pressing his warm body against Marcus's good leg, and Marcus dropped his hand to scratch behind the dog's ears. The Malinois had been his partner for the last 18 months of his deployment, a four-legged soldier with a nose that could detect explosives from 50 feet away and a loyalty that transcended species. When Marcus had been medevaced out after the blast, the paperwork to adopt Riker had been the only thing he'd fought for, the only thing that had seemed to matter in the chaotic aftermath of reconstructive surgeries and physical therapy and the slow, grinding realization that his career as an Army Ranger was over. The dog had saved his life in more ways than one. On the days when the weight of existence felt too heavy, when the bottle of pills in his medicine cabinet whispered promises of permanent peace, Riker was there. The dog needed to be fed, needed to be walked, needed someone to throw the tennis ball that he carried everywhere like a talisman. You couldn't abandon a dog who'd taken shrapnel meant for you, who'd dragged himself on 3 legs to lie across your chest while you bled out in the Afghan dirt, who refused to leave your side even when the medics tried to pull him away. Marcus finished his terrible coffee and stood, his movements still carrying the practiced economy of military training despite the prosthetic. He'd learned to walk again at Walter Reed, learned to run, learned to live with the phantom pains that convinced his brain his missing foot was still there, still trapped under tons of rubble, still burning. The mind was a cruel architect, building prisons out of memory and nerve endings that no longer existed. The November air hit him like a slap as he pushed through the hospital's main entrance. Detroit in late autumn was a study in gray, the sky the color of old concrete, the wind carrying the smell of the river and distant factories. He'd grown up here, in a small house in Hamtramck, a neighborhood that had been Polish and was now a beautiful chaos of Bangladeshi and Yemeni families, of mosques and churches and the kind of corner stores where everyone knew your name. His parents had run a small restaurant, Chen's Kitchen, serving an impossible fusion of Chinese-American comfort food that had somehow worked, egg rolls and Pyrgis sharing menu space in a way that made perfect sense if you'd grown up in Detroit. The restaurant was gone now, sold to pay his father's medical bills. Marcus had received the final paperwork while he was still at Walter Reed, had signed away his childhood with a hand that shook for more than just the medications. He had no siblings, no close family, just a handful of cousins scattered across the country who sent Christmas cards with awkward messages about being proud of his service. He'd stopped responding years ago. His truck was a 15-year-old Ford Ranger that burned oil and had a passenger door that only opened from the inside, but it was paid off and it ran. Riker jumped into the bed without needing to be told, settling into the nest of old blankets Marcus kept there. They drove through the city, past abandoned factories that stood like tombstones to an industrial era that had died before Marcus was born, past neighborhoods that were being slowly reclaimed by urban farmers and artists and stubborn families who refused to give up on Detroit's promise of resurrection. His apartment was in Corktown, in a converted warehouse that some optimistic developer had sectioned into studio units with exposed brick and original hardwood floors, selling the grit as charm. It was cheap because the building's heating system was temperamental and the neighborhood still had a reputation, though Marcus had never had any problems. Most people took one look at Riker and decided to conduct their business elsewhere. The dog was the best security system money could buy, and Marcus hadn't paid a dime. The mail was waiting in the narrow metal box in the building's vestibule, a collection of junk flyers and past due notices that Marcus had been ignoring with increasing dedication. His disability check covered rent and food, but not much else. He'd applied for jobs, dozens of them, but nobody wanted to hire a one-legged veteran whose resume was mostly redacted and whose only marketable skills involved breaking things and staying alive in places where most people would die. The interviews always went the same way, lots of "thank you for your service" platitudes followed by "we'll be in touch" lies. But today there was something different in the stack, a large manila envelope with a return address from a law firm in downtown Detroit, Morrison & Associates. Marcus stared at it, his thumb running over the embossed logo. He didn't have a lawyer. He didn't have anything that would require a lawyer. For a moment, he considered throwing it away unopened, because in his experience, official mail never brought good news. Riker whined softly, nosing at the envelope, and Marcus sighed. The dog was right. Ignoring problems didn't make them disappear, it just made them worse. He tucked the rest of the mail under his arm and climbed the 3 flights of stairs to his apartment, his prosthetic making soft clicking sounds against the worn wood. Inside, the studio was exactly as he'd left it, which was to say almost empty. A mattress on the floor, a small table with 2 mismatched chairs, a television he'd found on the curb that got 3 channels if you held the antenna just right. His few possessions fit in a single duffel bag, a habit he'd never broken from the army. Riker's things took up more space, the dog's bed in the corner, his food bowls, his collection of tennis balls in various states of destruction. Marcus sat at the table and opened the envelope with the kind of care he'd once used to defuse explosives. Inside was a letter, 3 pages of dense legal language that his tired brain struggled to process. He read it once, then again, then a third time because the words didn't seem to make sense in the order they were arranged. His uncle Raymond had died. Not that this was surprising news. Uncle Raymond had been 78 years old and had smoked 2 packs a day since before Marcus was born. What was surprising was that Uncle Raymond had apparently remembered Marcus existed, and more surprisingly still, had left him something in his will. Marcus tried to conjure a clear memory of his uncle and came up with only fragments. A big man with hands like catcher's mitts and a laugh that could shake windows. He'd been his father's older brother, had served in Vietnam, had come back changed in ways that the family spoke about in whispers. He'd never married, never had kids, had worked for Brinks as an armored car driver for 40 years before retiring to a small house somewhere in the city. Marcus remembered visiting once or twice as a child, remembered a cluttered living room that smelled like cigarette smoke and Old Spice, remembered his uncle showing him a collection of military patches and medals that were displayed in a shadow box on the wall. But they hadn't been close. Raymond had been the family eccentric, the one who showed up to gatherings late or not at all, who'd drift in and out of their lives like smoke. After Marcus's father died, he didn't think he'd seen or spoken to Uncle Raymond at all. He'd assumed the old man had passed years ago, another casualty of time that nobody had bothered to mention. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. According to the letter, Raymond had died 6 weeks ago of emphysema, alone in his house, and had been discovered by a neighbor who'd noticed the mail piling up. The estate was small, the lawyer explained, mostly debts in a house that would need to be sold to cover them. But there was one specific bequest to Marcus Chen, his only living relative. Uncle Raymond had left him an armored truck. Marcus read that line 5 times. An armored truck. Not a car, not a modest savings account, not even a watch or a set of golf clubs. A 1976 Brinks armored truck that Raymond had apparently purchased when the company had decommissioned it, a vehicle he'd kept in a rented warehouse space on the east side for reasons the lawyer's letter didn't explain and probably didn't understand. The letter included an address for the warehouse, a set of keys, and a polite request that Marcus clear out the space within 30 days as the rent was 3 months overdue and the property management company was threatening to auction off the contents. There was also a business card for James Morrison, the attorney handling the estate, with a handwritten note on the back that said, "Call me. We should talk about your uncle." Marcus set the letter down and stared at the water-stained ceiling of his apartment. An armored truck. It was so absurd that he almost laughed, except nothing had been funny in a very long time. What was he supposed to do with an armored truck? He could barely afford gas for his regular truck. Where would he park it? What possible use could he have for a vehicle designed to transport money he didn't have? Riker padded over and rested his chin on Marcus's knee, his dark eyes full of a concern that felt almost human. Marcus scratched the dog's ears, feeling the familiar texture of scar tissue under the fur where shrapnel had caught him. They matched, he and the dog, both of them carrying the physical evidence of a war that most Americans had stopped thinking about years ago. He should call the lawyer, he supposed. Find out what was involved in just signing the truck over to someone else, letting them sell it for scrap or whatever you did with ancient armored vehicles. He didn't need another complication in his life. He was barely managing the complications he already had. But something in the letter nagged at him, a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit. Why would Uncle Raymond leave him specifically this truck? Why not just sell it himself, or leave instructions for the estate to dispose of it? Why go through the trouble of making sure Marcus, a nephew he barely knew, received this particular vehicle? Marcus picked up the business card and turned it over in his fingers. The note on the back was written in shaky handwriting that suggested Raymond had written it himself, probably not long before he died. "We should talk about your uncle." What did that mean? What was there to talk about? He looked at Riker, who was watching him with the patient intensity that dogs seemed to reserve for the humans they'd adopted. The dog's tail gave a single thump against the floor. Fine, Marcus thought. He'd go look at the truck. He'd clear out the warehouse, fulfill his obligation to the estate, and then he'd be done. It would give him something to do besides sit in his apartment and count the ways his life had gone wrong. It would be a mission, even if it was a pointless one. And Marines, even former ones who'd become Army Rangers, always completed their missions. He called the number on the business card. A secretary answered, professional and efficient, and put him through to James Morrison after only a brief hold. The lawyer sounded younger than Marcus had expected, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who'd delivered bad news to a lot of people. "Mr. Chen, thank you for calling. I'm sorry for your loss." "I didn't really know him," Marcus said, "because it seemed important to be honest about that." "So I understand. Your uncle was a very private man. But he was quite specific in his instructions regarding the truck. He wanted you to have it. Do you know why?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Not exactly. I handled your uncle's affairs for the last few years. He came to me about 8 months ago to update his will. Before that, everything would have gone to the state. He told me he'd been thinking about family, about legacy. He seemed to think you'd understand what to do with the truck. I have no idea what to do with an armored truck. He said you would figure it out. He was quite insistent about that." Morrison's voice softened slightly. Mr. Chen, I know this seems strange. But your uncle was adamant. He made me promise that you'd at least go look at it before making any decisions. Would you be willing to do that? Marcus thought about his empty calendar, his empty bank account, his empty life. What did he have to lose? Yeah. I can do that. Good. I'll email you the address and the access codes for the warehouse. The keys your uncle left are in the envelope, they should work for the truck itself. If you need anything, please don't hesitate to call. After hanging up, Marcus sat for a long time in the gathering darkness of his apartment. The November sun set early, painting the room in shades of gray that matched his mood. He thought about Uncle Raymond, about a man who'd gone to war and come back changed, who'd spent 40 years driving an armored truck through Detroit streets, who'd died alone with nothing but debts and a strange vehicle to show for a life lived. He thought about legacy, about what people left behind when they were gone. His parents had left him recipes he'd never learned to cook and memories that hurt too much to examine closely. What would he leave? A box of medals he never looked at? A dog who would outlive him and end up in a shelter? Riker whined again, and Marcus realized he'd been sitting in the dark for over an hour. He stood, his prosthetic protesting the stillness, and flipped on the light. The dog looked up at him expectantly. Want to go see a truck tomorrow? Marcus asked. Riker's tail wagged, because as far as the dog was concerned, any adventure that involved Marcus was a good adventure. Marcus wished he could bottle that kind of uncomplicated optimism, that ability to find joy in the simple act of being together. He spent the evening reading through the rest of the lawyer's documents. There wasn't much. Uncle Raymond had lived on his pension and Social Security, had no savings to speak of, no valuable possessions beyond the truck. The house would be sold to cover outstanding debts and the cost of burial. There would be nothing left over. A whole life reduced to paperwork and an armored vehicle nobody wanted. That night, Marcus lay on his mattress with Riker pressed against his side, the dog's warmth a comfort against the cold that seemed to seep up through the floorboards. He thought about the truck waiting in its warehouse, a relic from another era when Detroit had been the engine of American manufacturing, when armored cars had rumbled through streets delivering the money that kept the city running. Sleep came in fits and starts, interrupted by dreams that mixed his uncle's imagined face with memories of Afghanistan, of convoys and explosions and the moment his world had gone white with pain. He woke several times to find Riker's nose pressed against his face, the dog's way of pulling him back from whatever dark place his mind had wandered to. Morning arrived gray and cold, the kind of November day that promised winter was coming whether you were ready or not. Marcus went through his routine with mechanical precision, the same routine he'd followed for 2 years since leaving Walter Reed. Coffee, medications, physical therapy exercises for his leg, breakfast for Riker, then breakfast for himself. Structure was important. Structure kept the chaos at bay. The warehouse was on the east side, in an industrial area that had seen better decades. Marcus drove through streets lined with chain-link fences and buildings whose windows were either broken or covered with plywood. But there were signs of life too, a community garden bursting with end-of-season vegetables, a mural depicting Detroit's automotive history, a group of kids playing basketball on a court where the hoops had no nets but their laughter was pure. The warehouse itself was a low-slung concrete building that looked like it had been built during the Cold War and hadn't been updated since. A faded sign declared it as Secure Store Detroit Climate-Controlled Storage. The parking lot was cracked asphalt sprouting weeds, and the entire place had an air of shabby neglect. Marcus pulled up to the security gate and punched in the code Morrison had sent. The gate groaned and rolled aside, revealing rows of identical orange roll-up doors. According to the email, Raymond's unit was D17, in the back corner of the complex. The drive through the facility was like touring a museum of abandoned dreams. Storage units full of furniture that families had meant to reclaim someday, business inventory from shops that had closed, the accumulated debris of lives in transition. Marcus had learned in the army that Americans were hoarders by nature, unable to let go of anything, convinced that someday they'd need that box of college textbooks or those skis they'd used once in 1987. Unit D17 was larger than the others, a double-wide space with a garage-style door instead of a roll-up. Marcus parked his truck and got out, Riker immediately jumping down to investigate this new territory. The air smelled like rust and old oil, industrial perfume that took Marcus back to his childhood, to the auto shops that had dotted his neighborhood. The key from the envelope fit the padlock securing the door. It opened with a resistance that suggested nobody had touched it in months. Marcus grabbed the handle at the bottom of the door and heaved upward. The door rose with a screech of protesting metal, and light flooded into the space beyond. There it was. The armored truck sat in the center of the warehouse like a beached whale, a massive vehicle that seemed even larger in the enclosed space. It was painted a faded gray-green, the kind of institutional color that had probably been chosen because it was cheap and practical. The Brinks logo was still visible on the side, though someone had painted over it in a half-hearted attempt at covering the branding. The truck was boxy and brutal, all right angles and reinforced steel, with tiny windows and wheels that looked like they could crush anything in their path. Marcus walked around it slowly, taking in the details. The vehicle was old, that was immediately obvious. 1976, the lawyer had said, which made it older than Marcus by a decade. The body showed its age, patches of rust blooming along the lower panels, dents and scrapes that told stories of decades on Detroit streets. But it was also clear that someone, presumably Uncle Raymond, had taken care of it. The tires were relatively new, the windows intact, and when Marcus peered through the windshield, the interior looked clean. Riker was circling the truck, sniffing with the intensity he usually reserved for threats. His posture was alert but not aggressive, more curious than concerned. Marcus watched the dog work, that old familiar partnership falling into place. In Afghanistan, he'd learned to read Riker's body language like a second language, to trust the dog's nose over his own eyes. The back doors of the truck were secured with a heavy padlock. Marcus tried several keys from the ring before finding the right one. The lock opened with a satisfying click, and he pulled the doors wide. The cargo area was empty except for a single metal box bolted to the floor, the kind of secure container that had once held cash or valuables during transport. It was maybe 3 feet on each side, painted the same institutional gray as the truck's exterior. Another lock, another key. Inside the box was a thick envelope, the kind with metal clasps, and a single folded piece of paper. Marcus took both out, setting them on the truck's bumper. The paper was a letter, written in the same shaky handwriting as the note on the lawyer's card. Marcus, it began. If you're reading this, I'm dead, and you've come to look at the truck like I hoped you would. I know we weren't close. That's my fault, not yours. After Vietnam, I found it hard to be around family, hard to pretend I was the same person who'd left. Your father understood, I think. He never pushed. I followed your career from a distance. Your father used to tell me about you, about basic training, about Ranger School, about your deployments. He was proud, even though he worried. When I heard about your injury, about what happened to you over there, I wanted to reach out. But I didn't know what to say. What do you say to someone who's been through hell? Anything I could offer felt empty. So instead, I'm leaving you this truck. I know it seems crazy. But there's something you should know about it, something I never told anyone. During my time at Brinks, I was part of the team that decommissioned old vehicles. This one, truck number 847, had a reputation. Drivers used to call it Lucky 8 because crews that drove it always came back safe, even during the roughest years in Detroit's history, even during the riots. When they retired it, I bought it for almost nothing. I kept it because it felt like the one thing from that part of my life that had been pure. It had protected people. It had done its job. And I had an idea, maybe a crazy one, but I've had 40 years to think about it. I want you to check the floor of the cargo area. Really check it. The dog your father mentioned, the one that saved your life, bring him with you. Military dogs know things we don't. Trust his nose. Whatever you find, it's yours. You've earned it more than anyone. You served, you sacrificed, and you survived. Now it's time to live. Your uncle, Raymond. Marcus read the letter 3 times, his hands shaking slightly by the end. He looked at Riker, who had stopped his inspection of the truck and was sitting at attention, waiting for direction. The dog's ears were forward, his entire body focused on the cargo area of the truck. "You heard the man," Marcus said quietly. "Let's check the floor." He climbed into the back of the truck, Riker jumping up beside him with an ease that belied his old injuries. The cargo area was about 10 feet long and 6 feet wide, tall enough for Marcus to stand upright. The floor was steel, covered in a non-slip coating that had worn down to bare metal in patches. Marcus ran his hands over it, feeling for seams or irregularities. Nothing. Riker, meanwhile, had begun his own inspection. The dog started at the front of the cargo area, nose down, moving in a systematic pattern that Marcus recognized from their time-clearing buildings in Kandahar. Left to right, front to back, methodical and thorough. When Riker reached the center of the floor, he stopped. His body went rigid, and that whine started again, that sound Marcus had never heard until today. The dog began to paw at the floor, his claws scraping against the metal with increasing urgency. Marcus's heart rate picked up, adrenaline flooding his system in a way it hadn't since his last firefight. He knelt beside Riker, running his hands over the spot the dog had indicated. At first, he felt nothing different. Then his fingers caught on something, a tiny imperfection in the metal, a seam so fine it was almost invisible. He pulled his key ring from his pocket. Among the various keys was a small folding knife, a habit from his military days. He opened it and carefully worked the blade into the seam. There was resistance, then a small click. A section of the floor, maybe 2 feet square, shifted slightly. It was a hidden compartment, masterfully constructed to look like solid floor. Marcus's hands were steady now, muscle memory taking over. He'd cleared countless houses, searched hundreds of vehicles for hidden explosives or weapons. This was the same, just a different kind of hunt. He lifted the panel, and Riker's whining intensified. Below was a space about 8 inches deep, and it was filled with packages. They were wrapped in heavy plastic, vacuum-sealed, each one about the size of a briefcase. Marcus counted quickly. 8 packages total, stacked neatly. He pulled one out. It was heavy, maybe 20 pounds. Through the cloudy plastic, he could see bundles of something. Paper. He tore a small hole in the plastic, and his breath caught in his throat. Money. Stacks and stacks of cash, all $100 bills, bound with paper bands that had turned yellow with age. The bands were stamped with a bank name, Michigan United Trust, and a date, 1982. Marcus sat back on his heels, his mind racing. He pulled out another package, then another. They were all the same, all filled with tightly packed currency. 43 years old, but money was money. The bills looked pristine, protected from moisture and decay by the plastic in the sealed compartment. He started doing math in his head. Each bundle in the package looked like $10,000. Each package had multiple bundles, maybe 20 or 30. 8 packages total. He was looking at millions of dollars. Literally millions of dollars hidden in the floor of an armored truck that his uncle had kept in a warehouse for decades. Riker had calmed down now that Marcus had found what the dog had been trying to show him. The Malinois sat watching his human, tail wagging slowly, proud of himself for doing his job. Marcus reached out and hugged the dog, pressing his face into the warm fur. "Good boy," he whispered, his voice shaking. "Such a good boy." His mind was a whirlwind. Where had this money come from? Had Uncle Raymond stolen it? That seemed impossible. The man had been many things, but by all accounts, he'd been honest, had worked the same job for 40 years, had died with nothing but debts. You didn't steal millions of dollars and then die broke in a small house. Had it been on the truck when Raymond bought it? That seemed more likely. Brink's trucks transported money, after all. But wouldn't they have found it during decommissioning? Unless they hadn't looked, had assumed the vehicle was clean, had sold it without the thorough inspection that would have revealed the hidden compartment. Marcus pulled out the thick envelope that had been in the metal box. Inside were documents, dozens of them, yellowed with age. He flipped through them quickly. Bank records, manifests, newspaper clippings. The clippings were all from 1982, all about the same event. A robbery. An armored car robbery outside a Michigan United Trust branch in downtown Detroit. 2 guards injured but survived. $3 million stolen, never recovered. The suspects had been arrested, convicted, sent to prison. But the money had vanished. There was a handwritten note paper clipped to the clippings, again in Uncle Raymond's handwriting. Found it during decommissioning in 1986. Realized what it was. Couldn't turn it in without questions I couldn't answer. Couldn't spend it without raising suspicion. Kept it hidden, thought maybe someday there would be a right answer. Never found one. Maybe you will. Marcus's hands trembled as he set the papers down. His uncle had found stolen money, had kept it secret for decades, had died without ever using a penny of it. And now it was Marcus's problem, his burden, his impossible choice. The money was stolen, that much was clear. But from whom? The bank would have been insured. The actual loss would have been spread among shareholders and insurance companies, entities that had long since recouped their losses or gone out of business. The statute of limitations on the robbery had expired years ago. The men who'd committed the crime had served their sentences, were probably dead by now given how long ago it had happened. Legally, the money was probably still the property of someone, some corporate entity or insurance company. Morally, turning it in was the right thing to do. But practically, what would happen? It would disappear into some bureaucratic process, would be fought over by lawyers, would ultimately end up in accounts that didn't need it. Or Marcus could keep it. Could take the money his uncle had left him, could pay off his debts, could actually live instead of just surviving. Could maybe even do some good with it, help other veterans who were struggling, donate to the organizations that helped military dogs find homes after retirement. He thought about the letter from Uncle Raymond. Now it's time to live. His uncle had kept this secret for decades, had let it eat at him rather than either turning it in or using it. He'd been paralyzed by the same moral complexity that Marcus was feeling now. And he'd died having never resolved it, leaving that burden to someone else. Riker nudged Marcus's hand, bringing him back to the present. The dog's eyes were full of trust, of the simple faith that Marcus would figure out what to do. Dogs didn't understand moral complexity. They understood loyalty, duty, the pack. In Riker's world, Marcus was alpha, and alpha made the decisions. Marcus looked around the warehouse, at the truck that had protected its secret for so long, at the packages of money that represented both incredible opportunity and impossible responsibility. He thought about his empty apartment, his unpaid bills, his uncertain future. He thought about the men who'd stolen this money, who'd injured 2 guards in the process. He thought about the insurance companies and banks that had long since written off the loss. And he thought about Uncle Raymond, a man who'd gone to war and come back carrying invisible wounds, who'd spent 40 years doing an honest job, who'd found something that wasn't his and had been too honest to use it and too afraid to turn it in. The right answer wasn't obvious. Maybe there wasn't a right answer. Maybe there was only the answer Marcus could live with, the choice he could make and still look at himself in the mirror. He carefully repacked the money into its compartment, closed the hidden panel, and climbed out of the truck. He locked the cargo doors and then closed the warehouse, securing the padlock. Riker jumped into his regular truck without being asked, settling into the passenger seat. They drove in silence through the streets of Detroit, past neighborhoods that had died and been reborn, past empty lots that had become urban farms, past murals that declared this city's refusal to give up. Detroit was a survivor, just like Marcus, just like Riker. It had been knocked down and had gotten back up, had lost everything and had found new reasons to keep going. When they got back to the apartment, Marcus opened his laptop, something he rarely did because there was seldom a reason to. He started researching. Michigan United Trust had indeed gone out of business in the early 90s, absorbed by a larger bank that had itself been absorbed during the 2008 financial crisis. The insurance company that had covered the robbery had gone bankrupt in 1995. The 2 guards who'd been injured had both retired, one had died in 2003, the other was living in Florida. The money was an orphan, a piece of history that belonged to entities that no longer existed, stolen by men who'd already paid their debt to society. Legally, it probably belonged to some successor bank or insurance company, but tracking down the rightful owner would require revealing the money's existence, would invite questions that Marcus couldn't answer without implicating his uncle. He spent hours going down research rabbit holes, reading about unclaimed property laws, about statutes of limitations, about the ethics of found money. The sun set outside his window, and he kept reading, kept searching for an answer that would make the choice easy. Riker eventually got tired of being ignored and jumped up onto Marcus's lap, all 70 pounds of dog settling into a space not designed for anything larger than a house cat. Marcus laughed despite himself, closing the laptop and wrapping his arms around the dog. "What do you think, buddy?" he asked. "What would you do?" Riker licked his face, which wasn't particularly helpful as moral guidance but was comforting nonetheless. Dogs lived in the moment. They didn't agonize over past mistakes or future consequences. They just were, fully present, fully alive. Marcus thought about living. Really living, not just surviving. What would that look like? He tried to imagine a life where he didn't worry about money, where he could afford proper healthcare, where he could maybe even do something meaningful. He thought about other veterans he'd met at the VA, men and women who were struggling even harder than he was, who needed help that the system wasn't providing. He thought about Riker, about the hundreds of other military working dogs who retired each year, many of them ending up in shelters because their handlers couldn't afford to adopt them or didn't know how. What if there was a way to help them? What if there was a way to turn this impossible windfall into something good? The idea started forming slowly, the way most good ideas do, not as a lightning bolt but as a gradual dawning. He wouldn't keep the money for himself, not all of it anyway. He'd take what he needed to survive, to get ahead, to actually live. And the rest, the vast majority, he'd find a way to use it to help others. Quietly, anonymously, in ways that wouldn't invite questions about where the money came from. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't entirely honest. But it was something Uncle Raymond hadn't been able to do, couldn't do. The decision didn't come all at once like some dramatic revelation, but rather crept up on Marcus over the following days like dawn breaking over the city skyline. He returned to the warehouse 3 more times that week, each visit feeling like he was approaching something sacred and dangerous in equal measure. Riker accompanied him every time, the dog's presence grounding him when the enormity of what lay hidden beneath that steel floor threatened to overwhelm his capacity for rational thought. On the 4th visit, Marcus brought tools. Not to remove the money, not yet, but to understand the truck itself better. He'd spent his entire adult life learning to assess vehicles for threats, to understand their mechanics, their vulnerabilities. Now he applied that same methodical approach to Uncle Raymond's final gift. He crawled beneath the chassis with a work light, examining the undercarriage for signs of tampering or weakness. He opened the hood and studied the engine, a massive diesel beast that looked like it could run for another 40 years if properly maintained. He checked the tires, the brakes, the steering mechanism. What he discovered was both surprising and somehow perfectly fitting for a man like his uncle. The truck had been meticulously maintained. Every fluid was clean, every belt intact, every connection solid. Uncle Raymond had kept this vehicle in working order for decades, had clearly started it regularly, had treated it with the kind of care usually reserved for classic cars or beloved pets. This wasn't just a storage container for stolen money. This had been Raymond's project, his purpose, his way of staying connected to something that mattered. Marcus found a logbook tucked into a small compartment behind the driver's seat, a spiral notebook with entries dating back to 1986. His uncle had recorded every oil change, every tire rotation, every minor repair. The entries were brief and factual, written in that same shaky handwriting that had delivered Marcus his final message. But there were other notes too, scattered throughout the years. Brief observations about the weather, about Detroit's changing landscape, about memories that surfaced during the long hours Raymond spent maintaining his secret. One entry from 1994 caught Marcus's attention and held it like a fishhook. Saw a young soldier at the gas station today, couldn't have been more than 19. Had that look we all get, like he was seeing something nobody else could see. Wanted to tell him it gets easier, but I would have been lying. It doesn't get easier. You just get better at carrying it. I hope he finds his truck, his purpose, whatever it is that keeps him going. Everyone needs something to protect. Marcus sat in the driver's seat of the armored truck, the logbook open in his lap, and felt tears he hadn't known were coming slide down his face. Uncle Raymond hadn't been crazy or criminal. He'd been trying to survive the only way he knew how, by giving himself a mission that never ended, a secret that required constant vigilance. The money hadn't been about greed. It had been about purpose, about having something that mattered, about being the guardian of something important even if he was the only one who knew it existed. Riker whined softly from the passenger seat and put his head on Marcus's leg. The dog always knew when the darkness was creeping too close, when Marcus needed an anchor to pull him back from whatever edge he was approaching. Marcus scratched behind Riker's ears and made a decision. He would keep the truck. Not just as a storage container for the money, but as an actual vehicle, as his uncle had done. He would maintain it, care for it, keep Raymond's mission alive while he figured out what his own mission should be. The money would stay hidden until he knew exactly what to do with it, until he had a plan that honored both the complexity of its origins and the possibility of its future. The warehouse rent was 3 months overdue, but Marcus had disability back pay he'd been hoarding for emergencies. He called the property management company and paid 6 months in advance, enough to buy himself time without raising questions. The woman on the phone sounded surprised and pleased, said they were happy to have reliable tenants in these uncertain times. Marcus wondered what she'd say if she knew what was stored in Unit D-17. His nights became consumed with research of a different kind. He started looking into nonprofits that serve veterans, reading their financial statements, understanding how they operated and where their funding came from. He discovered a landscape of organizations ranging from massive national charities with million-dollar budgets to small grassroots operations run by volunteers out of their living rooms. Some were well-managed and effective. Others were poorly run vanity projects that spent more on fundraising than actual services. He made lists, filled notebooks with ideas and calculations. If he had access to even a fraction of what was hidden in that truck, he could make a real difference. But how did you donate large amounts of cash without triggering investigations? How did you help people without explaining where the resources came from? The logistics were daunting, the legal implications terrifying. It was Riker who inadvertently provided the first piece of the solution. They were at the VA hospital for Marcus's regular appointment when a young Marine, couldn't have been more than 22, approached them in the waiting room. He was missing his left arm from the elbow down, the empty sleeve of his jacket pinned up in that way that was instantly recognizable to anyone who'd spent time around wounded veterans. The Marine was staring at Riker with an expression Marcus had learned to recognize, a mixture of longing and loss. Marcus had seen it before on the faces of handlers who'd been forced to leave their working dogs behind when they rotated home, regulations and bureaucracy creating separations that felt like abandonment. "That's a beautiful dog," the young Marine said, his voice carrying the flat effect of someone still processing trauma. "I had a partner like that. Fritz. German Shepherd. Best friend I ever had." Marcus gestured to the empty chair next to him. "Want to pet him? He's friendly when he's not working." The Marine sat down carefully, moving like someone whose body still surprised him with its new limitations. He reached out with his remaining hand and Riker immediately pressed against him, that uncanny ability dogs have to recognize who needs them most. The young man's face transformed, years of hardness melting away as he buried his fingers in Riker's fur. "What happened to Fritz?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. "Still over there. His handler died, and they reassigned him. I tried to adopt him when I got medevaced, but the paperwork got lost or ignored or whatever. By the time I was stable enough to follow up, they said he'd been retired to some facility. Won't tell me where, won't let me contact him. It's like he just disappeared." The Marine's voice cracked slightly. "He saved my life. Detected the IED before I drove over it. I lost my arm in the blast, but I'm alive because of him. And I can't even know if he's okay. Marcus felt something crystallize in his mind, a sense of purpose clicking into place like a weapon being loaded. This was it. This was what the money could do, what it should do. Not building grand monuments or funding administrative overhead, but solving specific, immediate problems for people who needed help and couldn't get it through official channels. "Give me your contact information," Marcus said. "I might be able to help." The Marine looked skeptical, that protective cynicism that grows like armor around people who've been disappointed too many times. But he pulled out his phone and they exchanged numbers. His name was Danny Torres, and he was living with his parents in Warren while he figured out what came next. After his appointment, Marcus spent the rest of the day on his laptop, navigating the labyrinthine bureaucracy of military working dog adoptions. It was as bad as Danny had described, a maze of regulations and procedures that seemed designed to discourage rather than facilitate reunions between handlers and their partners. But Marcus had learned patience in the Army, had learned that every system had vulnerabilities if you knew where to look. He started making calls, using his own military credentials to establish legitimacy, claiming to be researching a story about retired working dogs for a veterans magazine that didn't exist. He was transferred a dozen times, left messages that went unreturned, hit dead ends that would have discouraged someone less committed. But he'd cleared buildings filled with insurgents and survived an IED blast. Government bureaucracy was annoying but not actually dangerous. On the third day, he finally reached someone helpful, a staff sergeant at Lackland Air Force Base who managed the military working dog program. The man was initially guarded, but something in Marcus's voice, or maybe his story, softened his resistance. "Fritz, you said? Give me the handler's name and service dates." Marcus provided Danny's information and waited while keyboards clicked in the background. The silence stretched long enough that Marcus started to worry the connection had dropped. "Okay, I found him," the staff sergeant finally said. "He's at a contractor facility in North Carolina. Retired 8 months ago due to age and stress. According to these notes, he's been difficult to place. Keeps trying to escape, not eating well. They're thinking he might need to be, well, they're considering euthanasia if his condition doesn't improve." Marcus's hand tightened on the phone. "Can his handler adopt him?" "Normally yes, but according to this file, they reached out and never got a response. Assumed he wasn't interested. The paperwork got lost. He never received it. He's been trying to find Fritz for months." There was another long pause. "Look, I shouldn't be telling you this, but these dogs gave everything for us. If there's a handler who wants his dog back and the dog's not thriving in retirement, I can push that adoption through. But it needs to happen fast. They're making decisions about Fritz next week." Marcus got the contact information for the contractor facility and promised he'd make it happen. After hanging up, he sat staring at his phone, mind racing through logistics. The facility would want payment for transport, would have fees and expenses. Danny Torres was living with his parents, was probably drowning in medical debt like most wounded veterans. He wouldn't have thousands of dollars to spare for rescuing his dog. But Marcus knew where there were millions of dollars that nobody was using, money that had been frozen in time for 40 years while good people struggled and suffered. This was exactly the kind of problem that money could solve, and wasn't solving problems what money was supposed to do? He called Danny Torres. The young Marine answered on the second ring, his voice wary in the way of people who've learned not to hope too hard. "I found Fritz," Marcus said without preamble. "He's in North Carolina, and he's not doing well. They're considering putting him down if he doesn't improve." He heard Danny's sharp intake of breath, then silence. When the Marine spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. "I don't have money for transport or adoption fees or whatever it costs. I can barely cover my own expenses." "You don't need money," Marcus said. "I'm going to take care of it. All of it. I just need you to fill out the adoption paperwork and be ready to receive your dog." "Why would you do that?" "You don't know me." Marcus looked at Riker, who was lying in his usual spot by the window, watching the street below with alert eyes. "Because someone helped me keep my dog when I needed him most. Because Fritz earned the right to be with his handler. Because it's the right thing to do and I can do it, so I will. I can't accept charity. It's not charity. It's justice. Fritz saved your life. The least we can do is give him a good retirement with the person he loves. Let me do this, Danny. Please. There was a long silence, and Marcus could hear muffled sounds that might have been crying. Finally, Danny said, "Okay. Thank you. I don't know how to thank you. Just take good care of him. That's all the thanks I need." Marcus spent the next week orchestrating Fritz's rescue with the same precision he'd once applied to military operations. He contacted the facility, arranged for transport, paid all the fees with a wire transfer from his meager savings account that left him nearly broke but somehow feeling wealthier than he ever had. He filled out paperwork, made follow-up calls, confirmed and reconfirmed every detail. The money in the truck remained untouched. Marcus had decided he needed to prove to himself that he could do good without it first, that his motives were pure before he started spending stolen cash on noble causes. If he couldn't help Danny and Fritz with his own resources, he had no business playing philanthropist with someone else's money. Fritz arrived on a cold Tuesday morning, transported in a van by a contractor who specialized in animal relocation. Marcus had arranged to meet them at Danny's parents' house in Warren, wanting to witness the reunion, needing to see that this gamble on goodness had paid off. The Torres family lived in a small ranch house with a chain-link fence and a yard that had been meticulously maintained. Danny's mother answered the door, a short woman with worried eyes who'd clearly been crying recently. She shook Marcus's hand with surprising strength and invited him inside where Danny was waiting in the living room, sitting forward on the couch like he might launch himself through the window at any moment. When the van pulled up, Danny was out the door before Marcus could say anything. The contractor opened the back and a large German shepherd emerged, moving stiffly, his coat dull and his eyes haunted. Fritz looked around the unfamiliar surroundings with the wariness of an animal who'd given up expecting anything good. Then he saw Danny. The transformation was instantaneous and complete. Fritz's entire body language changed, ears perking forward, tail starting to wag, a sound emerging from his throat that was part whine and part joy. He lunged forward against the lead, and the contractor wisely let go. Fritz covered the distance to Danny in seconds, and the young Marine dropped to his knees to meet him. The dog practically climbed into Danny's lap, licking his face, pressing against him with a desperation that suggested he'd been holding himself together through sheer will and had finally found permission to fall apart. Danny wrapped his remaining arm around the dog and buried his face in Fritz's fur, his shoulders shaking with sobs. Marcus watched from the porch with Riker at his side, his own vision blurring. Danny's mother stood next to him, tears streaming down her face, one hand pressed to her mouth. The contractor who'd delivered Fritz was wiping at his eyes with the back of his hand, not even pretending he wasn't affected. It took almost 10 minutes before Danny could compose himself enough to stand. Fritz refused to leave his side, pressing against Danny's legs, looking up at him with absolute adoration. The young Marine turned to Marcus, his face streaked with tears and dirt from Fritz's paws, and his expression held such gratitude that Marcus had to look away. "I'll never forget this," Danny said. "Never. Whatever you need, whenever you need it, I'm there. I owe you everything." Marcus shook his head. "You don't owe me anything. You and Fritz both served with honor. This is just the country keeping its promises, even if it takes longer than it should." He left before the emotion could overwhelm him, Riker trotting beside him back to his truck. As they drove away, Marcus glanced in the rearview mirror and saw Danny and Fritz in the front yard, the dog refusing to let his handler out of sight, the Marine sitting on the ground with his partner pressed against him like they could merge into one being if they just tried hard enough. That night, Marcus returned to the warehouse. He unlocked Unit D-17 and climbed into the back of the armored truck. He opened the hidden compartment and looked at the packages of money that had haunted his uncle for decades. His hands were steady now, his purpose clear. He carefully removed one package, the smallest one, and opened it. Inside were bundles of $100 bills, more money than he'd ever held at once. He counted out $50,000, replaced the rest, and sealed the compartment again. $50,000 would replenish his savings, would give him a cushion to work with, would allow him to help more people like Danny without leaving himself vulnerable. It felt wrong and right in equal measure, taking money that wasn't his to solve problems that shouldn't exist. But the alternative was letting the money sit unused while people suffered, and that felt worse. Uncle Raymond had been paralyzed by the impossibility of finding a perfect solution. Marcus was choosing to accept imperfection in service of action. Over the next 3 months, Marcus became a ghost philanthropist. He established patterns and protocols, rules he wouldn't break no matter how tempting. He never used the money for personal luxury, only for necessities and for helping others. He never took more than he absolutely needed. And he never, ever told anyone where the resources came from. He helped a female veteran in Flint who was about to lose her house due to medical debt, sending an anonymous cashier's check that cleared her mortgage. He funded the adoption of 6 more military working dogs, reuniting them with handlers who'd been told reunions were impossible. He paid for a wheelchair-accessible van for a Marine who'd lost both legs, the vehicle showing up one morning with a note that said simply "Thank you for your service." Each act of generosity chipped away at the mountain of money hidden in the truck, but more importantly, each one chipped away at the cynicism that had calcified around Marcus's heart since his injury. He started sleeping better, the nightmares receding not because he'd forgotten what he'd experienced, but because he was building something new to balance against the darkness. Riker seemed to sense the change in his human. The dog was more relaxed, more playful, occasionally bringing Marcus his tennis ball with the kind of optimistic enthusiasm that suggested he believed they might actually have fun together. They started taking longer walks through the city, Marcus pointing out changes and improvements to the dog like Riker cared about urban development. Maybe he did. Dogs were good at caring about whatever their humans found important. But Marcus knew he was being watched. It started subtly, a car that appeared too often in his neighborhood, a man at the coffee shop who seemed too interested in his laptop screen, a sense of attention that his military training had taught him to recognize. Someone had noticed the pattern of mysterious charitable acts, had started asking questions about their source. He became more careful, varied his routines, used multiple banks for cashier's checks, drove to different cities to make transactions. He felt like he was running an operation behind enemy lines, which in a way he was. The enemy was scrutiny, investigation, the revelation that would collapse everything he was trying to build. It was during this time that Marcus received a phone call that changed everything. The number was local but unfamiliar, and he almost didn't answer. Some instinct made him pick up on the last ring before voicemail. Marcus Chen? The voice was male, older, with the kind of authority that came from decades of being obeyed. Who's asking? My name is Robert Castellano. I'm a private investigator, and I've been hired to look into some unusual financial activity in the Detroit area. Activity that seems to benefit veterans specifically. Your name has come up in my research, Mr. Chen. I think we should talk. Marcus's blood ran cold. This was it, the moment he'd been dreading since he first opened that hidden compartment. I don't know what you're talking about. I think you do. And I think you're doing good work. I'm not calling to threaten you, Mr. Chen. I'm calling because I want to help. But first, we need to meet. Just you and me, somewhere public, somewhere you'll feel safe. Give me 1 hour of your time. If you don't like what I have to say, you never have to hear from me again. Every instinct Marcus had screamed that this was a trap, that meeting this investigator would lead to arrest, exposure, the end of everything. But another part of him, the part that had been carrying this secret alone for months, was curious. Who had hired this man? What did he actually know? And what could he possibly mean by wanting to help? Tomorrow, Marcus said. The coffee shop on Michigan Avenue, the one across from the old train station. 2 o'clock. I'll be there. I'll be wearing a blue jacket and I'll be alone. Thank you for trusting me enough to meet. Marcus hung up and immediately started planning. He told Danny Torres where he was going and when, gave him the investigator's name and instructions to call the police if Marcus didn't check in by 4 o'clock. He left a sealed envelope with his lawyer, Morrison, containing a full explanation of everything in case something happened to him. He made sure Riker had food and water, hugged the dog longer than usual, and tried not to think about all the ways this could go wrong. The next day dawned gray and cold, November sliding toward December, the city bracing for winter. Marcus arrived at the coffee shop 30 minutes early, found a seat with his back to the wall and a clear view of the entrance, positioned himself like he was preparing for an ambush because maybe he was. Robert Castellano walked in at exactly 2 o'clock. He was in his late 60s, tall and lean with silver hair and the bearing of someone who'd spent time in uniform. The blue jacket he'd mentioned was actually a navy pea coat, and he carried himself with the careful awareness of someone who'd learned to assess threats long ago. Their eyes met across the room, and Castellano approached with his hands visible, a gesture of peace that Marcus recognized and appreciated. He sat down across from Marcus without asking permission, signaled the waitress for coffee, and studied Marcus with sharp gray eyes that missed nothing. "You're being careful," Castellano said approvingly. "Good. That shows intelligence. I'm going to be very direct with you, Mr. Chen, because I think we're both too old for games. I know about the armored truck. I know about the money. And I know what you've been doing with it." Marcus felt his world tilting but kept his expression neutral. "You're going to have to be more specific." Castellano smiled, a gesture that held no malice. "Your uncle Raymond was a friend of mine. We served together in Vietnam, stayed in touch afterward. He told me about the truck, about what he'd found, about the impossible situation it created. He asked my advice more than once over the years. I told him the same thing every time. The money was cursed by its origin, but it could be blessed by its use. He was never able to make that leap. But you have." Marcus felt something unodd in his chest. "Who hired you to investigate?" "I hired myself. When Raymond died and I heard the truck had gone to you, I started watching to see what you'd do. Would you turn it in? Would you keep it for yourself? Would you do what Raymond couldn't and find a way to make it matter?" Castellano leaned forward, his voice dropping. "You chose the hardest path, the one that requires the most courage. You're trying to do good with resources that came from something bad. That's not easy, and it's not sustainable the way you're doing it." "What do you mean?" "I mean you're one man trying to solve problems that require infrastructure, systems, protection. You're operating in the open with no cover, no legitimate source for these funds. Sooner or later, someone else is going to notice. Someone less friendly than me. And then everything you've built will collapse, and the people you've helped might even be hurt by the investigation." Marcus knew he was right. He'd felt the vulnerability every time he mailed a check or arranged a payment. "What are you suggesting?" Castellano pulled a folder from inside his jacket and slid it across the table. "I'm suggesting we do this properly. I've spent the last 3 months setting up a foundation, completely legal, completely clean. It's funded by what appears to be legitimate investment returns from a trust established years ago. The money gets laundered through several legal channels before it reaches the foundation. By the time it's distributed, there's no way to trace it back to its origin." Marcus opened the folder and found incorporation papers, bank statements, a full organizational structure. This had to cost a fortune to set up. It did. I used some of my own money, considered it an investment in doing the right thing. But it needs capital to function, real capital. The kind of capital currently sitting in a hidden compartment in an armored truck. Castellano met his eyes. "I'm proposing a partnership, Mr. Chen. You provide the resources, I provide the infrastructure and expertise. Together, we build something that can actually change lives without risking yours in the process. Why would you do this? What do you get out of it?" Castellano's expression softened. "I get to help my friend's nephew honor his uncle's legacy. I get to use 40 years of investigation experience for something good instead of just catching cheating spouses and insurance fraudsters. And I get to sleep better at night knowing that money which came from violence and theft is being used to heal and help. That's worth more to me than any paycheck." Marcus stared at the papers in front of him, seeing possibility and danger in equal measure. This could be the answer he'd been looking for, or it could be an elaborate trap. But sitting across from him was a man who'd known Uncle Raymond, who understood the weight of carrying impossible secrets, who was offering not judgment but partnership. "I need to think about this," Marcus said. "Of course. Take your time. But not too much time. The longer you operate alone, the more exposed you become." Castellano stood, left money for both their coffees on the table. "One more thing. Your uncle wanted you to have something besides the truck. He gave it to me before he died, asked me to deliver it if you proved worthy of the trust he was placing in you." He pulled a small envelope from his pocket and set it on the table. "You've more than proven yourself, Marcus. He'd be proud of who you've become." Castellano walked out, leaving Marcus alone with the folder and the envelope. Marcus waited until the investigator was gone before opening the envelope with shaking hands. Inside was a single photograph, old and faded, showing two young soldiers in Vietnam. One was clearly Uncle Raymond, decades younger but with the same serious eyes. The other Marcus didn't recognize at first, but the stance, the way he held himself, was familiar. He flipped the photo over. On the back, in Raymond's handwriting, was written, "Robert Castellano, my brother in arms. The only other person who knows about the truck. If he offers to help, you can trust him. He saved my life more than once. Now let him save yours." Marcus sat in that coffee shop for another hour, reading through Castellano's proposal, studying the legitimacy of what had been created, feeling the weight of decision pressing down on him. Riker would be getting worried by now, but this choice couldn't be rushed. In the end, it came down to a simple question. Could he do more good alone or with help? And was his pride worth more than the additional lives that could be changed with proper infrastructure behind the effort? He pulled out his phone and called Castellano's number. The investigator answered on the first ring, as if he'd been waiting by the phone. "I'm in," Marcus said. "Let's do this properly." He could hear the smile in Castellano's voice. "Welcome to the team, son. Tomorrow we start building something that will outlast both of us." Marcus hung up and looked at the photograph of his uncle and the man who'd just offered him salvation. Two soldiers who'd survived a war and carried its scars for decades, who'd found each other in the chaos and forged a bond that transcended time. Now Marcus had his own partner in this strange war he'd inherited, this battle to do good with weapons forged from bad. He gathered the papers, tucked the photograph carefully into his wallet, and headed home to Riker. The dog would need to know that their mission had just expanded, that they were no longer operating alone. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new complications, new reasons to be careful. But tonight, for the first time since opening that hidden compartment, Marcus felt like he was walking towards something instead of running away. The money was no longer just a burden or a temptation. It was becoming a tool, a resource, a means to an end that his uncle had dreamed of but never achieved. The legacy was evolving, growing beyond one man and one truck and one impossible secret. It was becoming something bigger, something that might actually change the world in small, important ways. And Marcus Chen, who'd spent years believing his best days were behind him, felt the unfamiliar stirring of something he thought was dead. It took him a moment to recognize it, to name it, to accept it. It was hope. The foundation changed everything. Within 6 months, what had started as Marcus's solo operation became a legitimate organization helping hundreds of veterans across Michigan. Castellano's infrastructure worked flawlessly, the money flowing through legal channels that made it untraceable to its origins. They reunited 47 military working dogs with their handlers. They prevented 12 veteran suicides through emergency intervention and ongoing support. They paid off medical debts, prevented foreclosures, funded education, and created pathways back to civilian life for men and women the system had failed. Marcus moved out of his studio apartment into a modest house with a yard where Riker could run. He hired 3 other veterans to help manage the foundation's operations, giving them not just jobs but purpose. Danny Torres became their outreach coordinator, using his own story to connect with struggling veterans who'd stopped believing anyone cared. The armored truck remained in its warehouse, the hidden compartment slowly emptying as the money fulfilled its destiny. Marcus visited it once a month, maintaining it as Uncle Raymond had, keeping the logbook updated with the same meticulous care. It had become his meditation, his connection to the uncle who'd understood that sometimes the hardest battles were the ones you fought alone in silence. On the anniversary of finding the money, Marcus drove the truck for the first time. With Castellano riding beside him and Riker in the back, they took it through Detroit's streets, past the neighborhoods that had died and been reborn, past the people who refused to give up on their city. The truck handled like a tank, powerful and unstoppable, exactly what it had been designed to be. They parked outside the VA hospital and Marcus understood why his uncle had kept it running all those years. It wasn't about the money. It was about having something that protected people, something that served a purpose larger than itself. The truck had carried stolen money for decades, but now it carried hope, legacy, and the knowledge that even things born from darkness could be transformed into light. Marcus's nightmares stopped entirely. He slept through the night with Riker snoring beside his bed, woke to mornings that felt like gifts instead of burdens. The phantom pains in his missing leg faded to occasional whispers. He started dating again, joined a community group, learned to laugh without feeling guilty for it. The foundation grew, expanding beyond Michigan, helping veterans nationwide. The money lasted longer than Marcus expected because they invested wisely, because they operated efficiently, because every dollar was treated like the precious resource it was. By the time the last bundle was spent, they'd helped over 3,000 people, saved countless lives, and created a model that other organizations began to copy. Marcus kept the truck long after the money was gone. It sat in his driveway, maintained and ready, a reminder of where he'd been and what he'd become. Sometimes veterans would stop to look at it, drawn by its imposing presence, and Marcus would invite them in for coffee, would listen to their stories, would help however he could. Uncle Raymond's impossible burden had become Marcus's greatest blessing. The money that had paralyzed one man with its moral weight had freed another to finally live. And in helping others find their way home from war, Marcus discovered he'd found his own way home too. The armored truck sat gleaming in the afternoon sun, no longer hiding secrets but declaring them proudly. On its side, where the Brinks logo had once been, was painted the Foundation's name in bold letters. Second chances, it read. Because everyone deserved one, even money with a dark past, even veterans the world had forgotten, even broken men who'd lost their way and needed a mission to bring them back. Marcus stood beside it with Riker at his side, watching the sun set over Detroit, and felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Peace. Complete, uncomplicated peace. The war was finally over, and he'd won not through violence but through choosing every day to do the next right thing, even when the right thing was impossibly hard. Uncle Raymond had left him more than money. He'd left him purpose, partnership, and proof that redemption was always possible if you were brave enough to reach for it. The legacy was secure, the mission accomplished, and Marcus Chen could finally rest knowing he'd honored not just his uncle's memory, but his own hard-won survival. The truck would remain, outlasting them all, a monument to the truth that the heaviest burdens often carry the greatest blessings, if only you're strong enough to carry them home. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.